Before the restaurant fell silent, before a wine glass burst against the hardwood floor, before every pair of eyes in the room turned toward the corner table, a woman's voice cracked open the evening with 6 words she never planned to say. "You promised you'd never do this." The man sitting across from her didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, adjusted the cuff of his shirt, and smiled the kind of smile that isn't a smile at all. It's a warning dressed in teeth. "Do what?" he said, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Tell the truth? You can barely read a restaurant menu without moving your lips, Marin. You think anyone at this table is impressed by you?" A waiter carrying a bread basket froze mid-step. A couple near the window looked down at their plates. A woman 3 tables over put her hand on her husband's arm, not in affection, but in the instinctive gesture of someone watching a car accident unfold in real time. Marin Soledad did not move. She sat with her hands flat on the white tablecloth, her fingers pressing into the linen as though the table were the only thing keeping her from falling through the floor. Her eyes were glassy but unblinking. Her jaw was set in the particular way of a woman who had learned, through years of practice, that crying in front of this man only made it worse. 40 feet away, near the private dining room at the back of the restaurant, a man who had ruined better men than this stopped chewing his steak. Because some things, even a man like him could not stomach. Cesar Moretti did not react the way most people would have. He didn't look up sharply. He didn't turn his head. He set his knife and fork down on his plate with the precise, unhurried care of a man who never did anything by accident, and he listened. He listened the way a man listens when he's spent 40 years reading rooms, not for the words themselves, but for the architecture underneath them, the tone, the volume, the calibration of cruelty, the way the man at the corner table wasn't shouting. Shouting would have been simpler, easier to dismiss. This man was speaking at a conversational pitch, delivering his humiliation in measured doses, like a surgeon who wanted the patient conscious for every cut. Kaiser was 63. His suit was charcoal, single-breasted, tailored in a way that made it look like it had been born on his body. His hands were large and scarred across the knuckles, though the scars were old enough to have faded into pale ridges that most people mistook for veins. His face had the weathered stillness of carved stone, not handsome, not ugly, and simply present in a way that made the air around him feel heavier. He controlled an operation that stretched from the dockyards of Carvel Bay to the financial district. He employed men who didn't ask questions. He had relationships with people whose names never appeared in newspapers. And he had a rule that he'd followed since he was 24 years old. A rule drilled into him by a man who was now buried in an unmarked plot outside of Turing. You never intervene in another man's business unless you're prepared to finish what you start. But some rules were built to have exceptions. And the sound of that woman's voice had just become one. Leandros was the kind of restaurant that existed for a specific clientele. Not the wealthy, exactly. Wealth alone couldn't get you a table here. It was a place for people who understood that the best meals in any city were eaten in rooms with no signage, no social media presence, and no interest in being discovered. The entrance was a plain black door on Vassar Street, between a tailor shop that had been closed for a decade and a law office that kept irregular hours. There was no host stand. There was no wait list. You were either expected or you were not. Inside, the dining room held 14 tables, each one spaced far enough apart that conversations were private unless someone chose to make them otherwise. The walls were exposed brick, darkened by decades of kitchen smoke and candle wax. The ceiling was pressed tin, painted black, reflecting the amber light from wall sconces that hadn't been updated since the building was a textile warehouse in the 1940s. The floors were original hardwood, scarred and uneven, polished to a low shine that made them look like the surface of a river at dusk. The tablecloths were white, the napkins were cloth. The silverware was heavy and mismatched, collected over years from estate sales and restaurant closures across the state. Every piece had belonged to a place that no longer existed. There was something fitting about that. A restaurant full of inherited silverware, as if the room itself understood that the things that lasted longest were the things that had survived being discarded. The kitchen was run by a man named Orso, who never came out to greet the dining room. The wine list was handwritten on a single sheet of paper and changed weekly. The waitstaff wore black and spoke only when spoken to. It was the kind of place where silence was considered a service, where the absence of noise was not emptiness but a form of respect. A recognition that the people eating here had come not to be entertained, but to exist, for a few hours, in a space that asked nothing of them. Tonight, that silence had been broken, and every person in the room could feel the temperature change, the way a forest goes quiet before a storm, not because the storm has arrived, but because everything living knows it's coming. Marinsoleta was 32 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she'd pulled into a low knot at the base of her neck that evening, the kind of style that looked effortless, but had taken her 20 minutes in the bathroom mirror because Kieran had once told her that wearing her hair down in public made her look desperate for attention. She had green eyes that strangers used to compliment, back when she still made eye contact with strangers. Tonight they were fixed on the tablecloth, tracing the invisible geometry of the weave, counting threads the way some people count breaths. Not because the threads mattered, but because counting gave her somewhere to go inside her own head where his voice couldn't reach. She had met Kieran Vosh 7 years ago at a fundraiser for a children's hospital downtown. He'd been charming that night. Not the performative charm of a man trying to impress, but something quieter, more targeted, the kind of charm that made you feel like you were the only person in a room full of people. He'd asked her about her work. She was a junior archivist at the city's historical library, a job that paid modestly but gave her access to rooms full of century-old maps and handwritten ledgers that made her heart beat faster. He'd seemed genuinely fascinated. He'd asked follow-up questions. He'd remembered the name of a collection she mentioned 2 hours later and brought it up again at the end of the night, as if it had been living in his mind the entire time. That was the hook. Not flowers, not money, not grand gestures. Attention. The precise, surgical attention of a man who understood that the most effective way to capture someone is to make them feel seen. They were married 14 months later. The first warning happened on their honeymoon. They were in a coastal town called Bravora, staying at a small hotel overlooking the harbor. She'd ordered a drink at the hotel bar while Kieran was upstairs changing for dinner. When he came down and saw her laughing at something the bartender had said, a joke about the local seagulls, nothing more, he'd taken her arm and guided her back to the room with a grip that left 4 bruises in the shape of fingerprints on her bicep. He hadn't raised his voice. He'd closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed and explained, in the same calm tone he used for everything, that he didn't appreciate being embarrassed. That the bartender had been looking at her in a way that suggested she'd encouraged it. That a married woman shouldn't be sitting alone at bars. That this was a boundary, not a punishment. She had apologized. She remembered that clearly. The apology. The way it had come out of her mouth before she'd even decided to say it. Automatic, reflexive, the verbal equivalent of a flinch. And the way Kieran had nodded, as if the apology confirmed something he'd already known about her. That was the template. Every incident that followed was a variation on the same architecture, the calm voice, the reframing of his cruelty as her failure, the explanation that arrived wrapped in the language of love. I'm saying this because I care about you, because I see potential in you, because I want us to work. And the apology from Marin that sealed each cycle like a lock clicking into place. Over 5 years, the architecture expanded. The comments about her intelligence became daily. You wouldn't understand, was his answer to every question she asked about his business. Let me handle it, was his response every time she tried to make a decision. About groceries, about the thermostat, about what to watch on television. He edited her vocabulary. He corrected her grammar in front of friends. He once interrupted her mid-sentence at a dinner party to say, "What Maren is trying to say," and then delivered a version of her point that sounded nothing like what she'd been saying, but sounded articulate. And everyone at the table had nodded along, and she had sat there with her wineglass in her hand and felt herself disappear. The physical violence was infrequent but precise. A shove into the hallway wall after she'd spent too long talking to a neighbor. A grip on her wrist that twisted until the tendons burned because she'd forgotten to move the laundry from the washer. A slap on the side of her head. Not the face. Never the face. Because Kieran understood that faces were public and heads were private, hidden under hair, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking. He never left marks where people could see them. He was meticulous about that. The bruises lived on her upper arms, her ribs, the back of her neck. Places covered by sleeves and collars and the careful posture of a woman who had learned to dress around her injuries the way other women dressed around the weather. But the humiliation was where he lived. That was his instrument of choice. The cutting remark at a dinner party, the correction delivered in front of waiters. The anecdote about her failures told to his colleagues as though it were affectionate teasing. Maren tried to balance the checkbook last month. You should have seen it. Like watching a child do long division. While his hand rested on the back of her chair, and everyone laughed, and Maren laughed too because laughing was the only alternative to screaming. She had no children. Kieran had made sure of that. He'd told her during their first year of marriage that he wasn't ready, that they should wait until they were more stable, which was a word he used the way architects use load-bearing walls, to hold the entire structure in place. By year 3, she understood that not ready meant never, and that the decision had been made for her, quietly, unilaterally, without her consent. She had no close friends left. Kieran had removed them with the patience of a man pulling weeds. Her college roommate, Bettine, pushed out after Kieran accused her of putting ideas in Maren's head. Her coworker Philippa at the library edged away after Kieran showed up unannounced 3 times in 1 week to bring Maren lunch. Visits that felt less like generosity and more like surveillance. Her neighbor across the hall, an older woman named Dorrit, who used to invite Maren for tea. Gone after Kieran told Maren that Dorrit had made a comment about their marriage, a comment Dorrit had almost certainly never made. One by one, the connections severed. One by one, the exits sealed. Until tonight. When Kieran had decided that the private humiliation wasn't enough anymore, that the audience needed to be larger. That Maren needed to understand. In a room full of strangers eating expensive food on white tablecloths, exactly how small he believed she was. The couple nearest to Maren and Kieran's table were the first to stop pretending. The woman, mid-50s, silver earrings, a glass of Barolo she hadn't touched in 10 minutes, was staring at her plate with the fixed concentration of someone trying to will herself into another dimension. Her husband had set his fork down entirely. He was looking at the wall. Not at a painting, not at a sconce, just at the wall itself, as though brickwork were suddenly the most interesting thing in the room. But there was someone else watching, someone whose reaction mattered more than anyone else's in that dining room. A young woman sat alone at a table near the kitchen corridor. Her name was Sable Wen. She was 23. She worked at Leandro's 3 nights a week as a hostess, but tonight she was off duty, eating a meal that Orso had sent out for her, a plate of orecchietta with broccoli rabe and a glass of sparkling water. Because Orso did that for the staff sometimes, fed them like they were family, because to Orso they were. Sable had not been assigned to Maren's section. She had no professional obligation to observe the corner table. But she couldn't stop watching. Not because the scene was dramatic. Not because it was loud. But because she recognized it. She recognized the way Maren's hands pressed flat against the table, fingers spread, as though she were bracing for impact. She recognized the stillness of the woman's shoulders, not relaxed, but locked, the rigid stillness of someone who had trained her body not to react. She recognized the angle of Marin's chin, tilted slightly downward, not in submission, but in calculation. And she recognized the smile, that particular smile, the one that didn't reach the eyes, the one stitched on with thread made of practice and survival, the one that said, to anyone who had ever worn it themselves, I am not okay, but I cannot afford to let you see that. Sable knew that smile because she had inherited it. Her mother, Yevna, had worn it every Sunday at church. She had worn it at parent-teacher conferences while her fingers pressed into bruises on her thighs that Sable's father had put there the night before. She had worn it at the grocery store, at the post office, at the school pickup line, where she stood among the other mothers in long sleeves on warm days, and nobody asked why. Sable had been 9 years old when she'd first understood that the smile was a mask. She'd been sitting in the back seat of the car while her mother drove home from a birthday party. Yevna had been smiling the entire afternoon, laughing with the other parents, clapping when the children blew out the candles, holding a paper plate of cake she never ate. But in the car, when she thought Sable was asleep, the smile had fallen away like plaster crumbling from a wall. And what was underneath it was a face so tired, so emptied of everything except endurance, that Sable had closed her eyes and pretended to sleep harder because she was afraid that seeing it would make it real. Now, at 23, sitting in a restaurant where she sorted menus and greeted strangers for a living, Sable watched a woman she'd never met wear her mother's smile. And the recognition hit her in a place that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the muscle memory of a childhood spent learning to read rooms the way sailors read weather. Not for beauty, but for survival. She watched the man lean forward. She watched him say something she couldn't hear, but didn't need to, because the shape of his mouth and the angle of his posture told her everything. She watched Marin's right hand leave the tablecloth and move to her lap, where it gripped the fabric of her dress so tightly that the knuckles went white. And Sable set down her fork. Not because she had a plan, not because she knew what she would do, but because something inside her, something that had been formed in the back seat of a car at 9 years old, watching a mask fall from her mother's face, refused to let her keep eating while that woman sat there wearing the same one. She didn't move yet, but she stopped looking away. And across the room, without knowing it, she and Caesar Moretti were watching the same woman for the same reason, because both of them had seen that face before, in a life they couldn't go back to, and a memory they couldn't put down. Caesar Moretti had not always eaten in restaurants where the silverware was inherited and the silence was a courtesy. There had been a time, decades ago, in a life that existed now only in the locked rooms of his memory, when dinner meant a folding table in a kitchen with yellow wallpaper that was peeling at the seams, when the sound of cutlery was not the quiet clink of silver on porcelain, but the sharp crack of a plate hitting linoleum because his father had decided, mid-sentence, that the meal wasn't hot enough. His father's name was Tomislav. He had worked at a meatpacking plant on the outskirts of a town called Greenock, a place so small it didn't appear on most maps, where the air smelled like rendered fat, and the kind of silence that settles over communities where everyone knows what happens behind closed doors. Tomislav Moretti was not a large man. He was wiry, sharp-featured, with hands that were always red from the cold storage rooms at the plant. But his presence filled every room he entered the way smoke fills a hallway. Not because of size, but because of the anger he carried. An anger that had no origin anyone could name, that could be triggered by a fork placed on the wrong side of a plate, or a door closed too loudly, or a child breathing in a way that somehow constituted disrespect. Caesar's mother was Lenita. She was a seamstress who took in alterations from the women in Greenock, and sometimes from the next town over. She worked from a small table near the window in the living room, a table covered in pins and fabric scraps, and a measuring tape that she wore around her neck like a necklace. She was quiet. She was precise. She could fix a hem so cleanly that you'd never know it had been altered, and she could absorb a blow to the side of her head and return to her sewing within the hour, her hands steady and her stitches straight, as though pain were simply another piece of fabric to be folded and put away. Cesar had been 7 the first time he tried to stop it. He'd walked into the kitchen during one of his father's rages. A dinner plate had been thrown, a chair had been knocked over, and he'd stood in the doorway with his small fists clenched and said, "Leave her alone." Tomislav had looked at him, not with anger, with amusement, and that was worse, because the anger Cesar could understand. The amusement told him that his father didn't see him as a threat, or even as a person. He saw him as a minor interruption, a moth near a lamp, something to be brushed aside without adjusting your grip on anything that mattered. His father had backhanded him across the face, casually, the way you'd swat a fly. And then he'd turned back to Lenita, and Cesar had lain on the kitchen floor with his cheek against the cold linoleum, staring at the base of the refrigerator, where a single dust bunny trembled in the draft from under the door, and he had made a decision that a 7-year-old should never have to make. That one day, he would become the kind of man his father was afraid of. He had kept that promise. He had kept it so thoroughly and so completely that the boy on the kitchen floor and the man in the charcoal suit were almost unrecognizable as the same person. Almost. Because there were moments exactly like this one, when a man's voice carried across a dining room with the practiced cruelty of someone who had never been stopped, when the distance between the boy and the man collapsed entirely, and Caesar was 7 again, lying on linoleum, watching a dust bunny tremble, and feeling the same helpless fury that had shaped every decision he'd made since. Lenita had died when Caesar was 16. Pancreatic cancer. But Caesar knew the truth the doctors didn't write on the death certificate. His mother had died from living in a house where the air itself was a weapon, where every room held the residue of violence the way walls hold cigarette smoke. Invisibly, permanently. He had not cried at her funeral. He had stood beside the casket with his jaw set and his hands in the pockets of a borrowed suit and made a second promise to himself, that he would never watch someone be destroyed in front of him and do nothing. Not again. Not ever. And tonight, in a restaurant where the silence had been shattered by a man who believed his cruelty had no witnesses that mattered, Cesar Moretti felt both promises stir. Kieran was still talking. He hadn't stopped. The humiliation had moved from Marin's intelligence to her appearance. He was explaining to the table, to the air, to anyone within earshot, that she had spent an hour getting ready tonight and still managed to look like she'd borrowed someone else's clothes. He said it with a laugh, the kind of laugh designed to give everyone else permission to laugh too, to turn cruelty into entertainment, to make the victim complicit in her own degradation by surrounding it with the social mechanics of humor. No one laughed, but no one spoke either. Caesar stood up. He didn't push his chair back. He didn't make a sound. He rose from his table the way weather changes, not with announcement but with pressure. A shift in the atmosphere that every person in the room registered before they understood its source. He walked toward the corner table. His pace was unhurried. His hands were at his sides, visible, relaxed. He didn't look at Kieran. He looked at Marin. He stopped 4 feet from their table, close enough to be present, far enough to not be a threat. The geometry of his position was deliberate, angled slightly toward Marin's side of the table, his body a quiet partition between her and the rest of the room. Kieran looked up. His expression shifted through 3 stages in rapid succession: confusion, irritation, and then the particular brand of arrogance that belongs to men who have never been challenged in a space they consider theirs. "Can I help you?" Kieran said. Keezer didn't answer him. He looked at Marin. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was low, and it carried the weight of a man who understood that volume was not authority. Authority was precision. Marin blinked. Her eyes moved from Caesar to Kieran and back. She opened her mouth, and then closed it. And in that half-second of hesitation, Caesar saw everything he needed to see. The calculation, the risk assessment, the instant weighing of consequences that happens inside the mind of every person who has lived under someone else's control. She wasn't deciding whether she was all right. She was deciding what the cost of answering honestly would be. "She's fine," Kieran said, leaning forward. "We're having dinner. Do you mind?" Caesar still didn't look at him. His eyes remained on Marin. "I didn't ask him," Caesar said. "I asked you." The distinction landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. Because embedded in those 7 words was something Marin may not have heard in years, the recognition that her voice was separate from his. That her answer was her own. That the question belonged to her, not to the man who had been speaking for her all evening. Marin looked at Cesar. She studied his face with the speed and depth of a woman who had spent years reading men, reading the space between what they said and what they meant, between the hand that reached out and the hand that struck. She didn't find pity, which she would have rejected. She didn't find anger, which she would have feared. She found something she almost didn't recognize because it had been so long since she'd seen it directed at her. Respect. "No," Marin said. Her voice was barely audible. "I'm not all right." Kieran's face changed. The arrogance cracked. Underneath it was something rawer. The sudden, furious awareness that control was slipping, that the script he had written for this evening was being rewritten by a stranger who hadn't asked permission. "Marin," Kieran said, and his voice dropped into the register she knew best. The warning tone, the one that preceded consequences. "We should go." "She doesn't have to go anywhere," Caesar said. He said it without raising his voice, without shifting his weight, without so much as uncrossing his arms. But something in the sentence, something in the way it was delivered, with the calm finality of a man who did not make statements he couldn't enforce, made Kieran pause. And in that pause, Sable Wen appeared. She had crossed the dining room without anyone noticing, the way staff move through restaurants. Invisibly, purposefully, along the margins. She was carrying a glass of water. She set it on the table in front of Marin. Not in front of the couple. In front of Marin. Specifically, precisely, on Marin's side. "Can I get you anything else?" Sable asked, looking directly at Marin. Not at Kieran, not at Caesar. At Marin. It was a small act. A glass of water. A question directed at the right person. But Marin looked up at this young woman. This stranger who had brought her water she hadn't asked for and addressed her as though she were the only person at the table who mattered, and something in her face shifted. The mask loosened. The stitching gave way, just slightly, at the edges. "I think," Marin said slowly, "I'd like to sit somewhere else." Kieran stood up. "We're leaving." "You're leaving," Caesar said. And this time he looked at Kieran. And this time, Kieran saw the man behind the suit. Whatever he saw, it was enough. His mouth opened. It closed. He looked at Marin with an expression that promised consequences, a look she had seen 100 times before, the look that said, "This isn't over." But Caesar stepped between them, not aggressively, not dramatically. He occupied the space between the man and the woman the way a wall occupies the space between a storm and a house. Kieran picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He walked toward the door with the rigid, mechanical posture of a man whose pride had been punctured in public and who was already constructing the narrative that would make this someone else's fault. The bell above the door didn't ring when he left. The door at Leandros was too heavy for bells. It closed, with a deep, solid sound, like a chapter ending. Sable led Marin to a booth near the kitchen corridor, away from the other diners, away from the window, away from the table where the white tablecloth still held the indentations of Marin's pressed fingers. Caesar followed at a distance and sat across from her. He didn't speak. He placed his hands on the table where she could see them and waited. The waitress brought coffee without being asked. She set down a basket of bread, warm, wrapped in a cloth napkin. She didn't say anything. She didn't hover. She poured the coffee and left. Marin wrapped both hands around the mug. Her fingers were trembling. Not dramatically, not visibly to someone who wasn't watching closely, but Caesar was watching closely, and he saw the surface of the coffee ripple with each small tremor. She drank. She set the mug down. She looked at the table and began to speak. "We've been married 6 years," she said. "He wasn't always—" She stopped, reconsidered. "No, he was always like this. I just didn't see it at first. Or I saw it and I called it something else. I called it protectiveness. I called it high standards. I called it love." She said the word love the way someone says the name of a city they once lived in that had since been condemned, with recognition, with distance, with the faint disbelief that they had ever walked those streets and called it home. The grabbing started on the honeymoon, but the first time he actually hit me, closed fist, no pretending, was 3 months in. I'd come home late from the library. There was a new acquisition, a collection of 19th century surveyor maps, and I'd lost track of time. He was waiting in the living room with the lights off. He didn't yell. He took my wrist and twisted it behind my back and held it there until I apologized for something I hadn't done wrong. She paused. It happened again, and again, and every time there was a reason. I was too friendly. I was too slow. I was too loud. I took too long at the store. I wore the wrong dress. I looked at someone the wrong way. Sable had not left. She stood near the edge of the booth, not sitting, not intruding, but present. The way a lantern is present at the edge of a dark road. Close enough to see by. Far enough to not impose. She listened with her arms crossed over her chest, her fingers gripping her own elbows, and Cesar noticed that the young woman was holding herself together with the same rigid discipline that Marin was, the same controlled posture, the same steady breathing, the same refusal to let the surface crack. Marin continued. "He didn't just hit me, he dismantled me. He took apart every piece of who I was, and told me it wasn't good enough. My job, my friends, my family. I don't have any left. My mother is alive, but she lives 3 states away, and Kieran convinced me 2 years ago that she was toxic, that her phone calls were manipulative, and that I needed to cut her off for my own mental health." Marin's voice fractured on the last 2 words. For my own mental health, he used the language of healing to make me sicker. Cesar's jaw tightened. His right hand, resting on the table, closed slowly into a fist. Not a fist of violence, a fist of recognition. A fist that said, "I have heard this before, and it sounds exactly the same every time." "I don't have money," Marin said. "He controls the accounts. I have a debit card with a $200 weekly limit. He checks every transaction, every coffee, every grocery receipt, every parking meter. If something doesn't match, he asks questions. Not angry questions, calm questions, the kind that sound reasonable until you realize that reasonable questions don't make your hands shake." She looked at Cesar for the first time since she'd started talking. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She was past crying. She was in the territory beyond tears, the flat, exhausted landscape where the body has run out of ways to express what the mind keeps producing. "I can't leave," she said. "I have no money of my own, no friends, no family I haven't been cut off from, no car. It's in his name. No apartment. The lease is his. Even my phone is on his plan. He can see everywhere I go, everyone I call. I am standing in the middle of my own life, and I don't own a single piece of it." Then she said the part that changed the weight of the room. And he knows people. Kieran has connections. He has a lawyer who's helped him before, helped him make problems disappear. He told me once, during a fight, that if I ever tried to leave, he would make sure I ended up with nothing. No credibility. No case. No one who would believe me. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He said he'd tell everyone I was unstable, that I'd been making things up, that I was the one who was violent, and the thing that terrifies me, the thing that keeps me sitting at that table, wearing that smile, eating food I can't taste, is that I believe him. I believe that he could do it. Because he has spent 6 years building a world where his version of reality is the only one that exists, and I don't know how to prove that mine is real. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of the weight of every word she'd said. Full of the recognition on Caesar's face. Full of the way Sable's fingers had tightened on her own arms until the knuckles blanched. Caesar looked at Marin across the table. He let the silence hold for 3 full seconds. Then he spoke. "Your version is real," he said, "and we're going to prove it." Caesar pulled out his phone. It was an older model, plain, without a case. A phone carried by a man who understood that the most dangerous devices were the ones that stored everything. He kept his sparse. He dialed a number from memory. The phone rang once. "It's me," Caesar said. "I need Adair Lennox's number. Tonight." The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Declan Brask. Declan had worked with Caesar for 19 years. He carried 2 phones, slept 4 hours a night, and responded to instructions the way water responds to gravity. Immediately, without resistance, in the direction it was told to go. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask who the number was for. He texted it within 40 seconds. Caesar dialed again. "Adair, it's Caesar Moretti." The voice that answered was clipped, professional, and utterly unsurprised to be receiving a phone call at 9:30 on a Thursday night. Adair Lennox was a family law attorney who had practiced for 26 years and had a reputation among her peers that could be summarized in a single sentence. She did not lose cases she chose to take. "I have someone who needs your help," Caesar said. "Tonight." "Tell me." Caesar looked at Marin. "May I?" he asked. Marin nodded. Caesar spoke for 3 minutes. He laid out the situation with clean, unembellished precision. A woman, 6 years of domestic abuse, physical, psychological, and financial. Total control of assets, communications, and social connections by the husband. No independent income, no vehicle, no family access. A husband with legal connections and a stated intent to destroy her credibility if she attempted to leave. When he finished, there was a pause. Then Adair spoke. "Put her on." Caesar handed the phone to Marin. Marin held it the way someone holds an object they don't entirely trust, carefully, at a slight distance, as though it might change its mind. "This is Marin. Marin, my name is Adair Lennox. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. Answer them honestly. First, has he ever struck you?" "Yes." "Second, do you have any documentation? Medical records? Photographs? Texts? Voicemails? That reference or evidence the abuse?" Marin hesitated. "I went to an urgent care clinic once, 18 months ago. I told them I fell down the stairs. But the doctor, she wrote something in the notes. I saw her typing after I told her what happened. She looked at me like she didn't believe the stairs story." "Good. Medical professionals are trained to document suspected abuse regardless of the patient's stated cause. That record exists, and it will say what she saw, not what you told her." Third question. "Do you want to leave this marriage?" The question hung in the air, not because the answer was uncertain, but because no one had asked Marin what she wanted in so long that the experience of being asked, genuinely, without conditions, without the question being a setup for a predetermined answer, required a moment to process. Yes, Marin said. I want to leave. Then we start tonight. I'm going to need you to not go home. Do you understand? Do not return to the residence you share with your husband. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not until I tell you it's safe. I don't have anywhere to go. Caesar, who had been listening, spoke without looking up from his hands. Yes, you do. He made one more call. This one was to Declan again. The apartment on Hallworth, second floor. Have it opened, cleaned, and stocked within the hour. Linens, food, toiletries, a prepaid phone, no contract, no GPS, and Declan, make sure the locks are new. Declan didn't ask questions. He confirmed and hung up. Marin stared at Cesar. Her hands were no longer trembling. They were still. The dangerous stillness of a person standing at the edge of something they've imagined for years but never believed they'd reach. I can't accept this, she said. You're not accepting a gift, Cesar said. You're accepting a door. What you do after you walk through it is yours. Sable, who had been standing at the edge of the booth through all of it, spoke for the first time since she'd set the glass of water on the table. Take the door, she said quietly. My mother never got one. Marin looked at Sable. She looked at Cesar. She looked at the phone in her hand, where a woman named Adair Lennox was waiting on the other end of the line, already building a case, already thinking 3 moves ahead, already preparing to dismantle 6 years of architecture, one legal filing at a time. Okay, Marin said. Okay. Adair Lennox worked the way a demolition expert works, methodically, precisely, and with an intimate understanding of which walls were structural and which would collapse on their own once the right support was removed. Within 24 hours, she had obtained Marin's medical records from the urgent care visit. The doctor, a woman named Preetha Sundaram, had indeed documented what she observed. Bruising inconsistent with a fall. Patterned contusions on the upper arms suggesting grip force trauma. A note written in the careful clinical language of a physician who understood that medical records could become legal evidence. Patient presents with injuries that do not correspond to the reported mechanism. Suspected non-accidental trauma. Patient declined further discussion. That record alone was a foundation stone. But Adair didn't build cases on single stones. She subpoenaed Kieran Vosh's financial records. What they revealed was a textbook case of economic abuse. Marin's name had been systematically removed from joint accounts over a 3-year period. The $200 weekly debit limit was documented. Transaction monitoring was confirmed through bank correspondence that Kieran had initiated himself, requesting email alerts for every purchase over $5. He had created a paper trail of his own control and hadn't realized it because controlling people rarely imagine that the mechanisms of their control could be used against them. Adair filed for an emergency protective order on the second day. The judge who reviewed the petition, a woman named Honorable Corinne Bassett, who had spent 14 years on the family court bench and had seen enough cases to recognize the pattern of abuse from the shape of its shadow, granted the order within 6 hours. Kieran Vosh was prohibited from contacting Marin directly or indirectly, from approaching within 500 feet of her person or residence, and from accessing, freezing, or modifying any shared financial accounts pending the outcome of the divorce proceedings. He was served at his office, in front of his colleagues, in the middle of a Thursday afternoon. Adair had arranged that, deliberately. Men like Kieran Vosh operated on the currency of image, and the most effective way to destabilize a man who weaponized public perception was to make his private behavior public. On the 4th day, Adair filed for divorce on Marin's behalf, citing irreconcilable differences and a pattern of domestic abuse supported by medical documentation, financial records, and a sworn affidavit from Marin that ran 11 pages and described, in precise chronological detail, every incident she could remember across 6 years of marriage. On the sixth day, something unexpected happened. The neighbor, Dorrit, the older woman who used to invite Marin for tea, the one Kieran had driven away with a manufactured comment, contacted Adair's office. She had seen a news item about the protective order. She had something to say. Dorrit testified in a written statement that she had heard raised voices through the shared wall on at least 12 occasions over 4 years, that she had once seen Marin in the hallway with a bruise on her neck that Marin attributed to a curling iron accident, that she had called a domestic violence hotline for advice and been told she couldn't file a report without the victim's cooperation, and that she had never stopped feeling guilty for not doing more. On the ninth day, a second witness emerged. Philippa Gatz, Marin's former co-worker at the Historical Library, submitted a statement describing 3 instances in which Kieran had appeared at the library unannounced, monitored Marin's interactions through the glass doors of the reading room, and once told Philippa directly, with what she described as the coldest smile I've ever seen on a human face, that Marin didn't need friends at work. The case was building itself, not because Adair was manufacturing evidence, but because the evidence had always existed, scattered across medical files, bank records, neighbors' memories, co-workers' observations, waiting for someone to gather it and present it in a language the court could act on. Kieran Vosh had spent 6 years building a prison around Marin Soledad. He had built it carefully, invisibly, one wall at a time. He had not anticipated that someone would come along and use his own blueprints to tear it down. The apartment on Hallworth Street was on the second floor of a brownstone building with a wrought iron railing and a front door that stuck slightly when you opened it. A small imperfection that made a place feel like a home rather than a facility. The stairwell smelled like old wood and laundry detergent. The hallway was narrow, lit by a single window at the far end that let in a column of afternoon light on clear days. The apartment itself was small. 1 bedroom, a living room with a radiator that clicked and hissed like it was having a private conversation, a kitchen with a gas stove and a window above the sink that looked out onto a courtyard where someone had planted boxwood hedges. The floors were hardwood, worn smooth by years of footsteps, polished into the grain like a record of every ordinary morning that had ever happened in this room. The first night, Marin didn't sleep. She sat on the couch with the lights on and the deadbolt engaged and listened to the building settle around her. The radiator's click, the creak of the floor above, the distant sound of a television through the wall. Normal sounds, safe sounds, sounds that didn't carry the particular charge of a door opening at 11 p.m. and a pair of shoes being removed with the deliberate quiet of a man who wanted to control the exact moment his presence was known. She sat there until sunrise, not because she was afraid, but because she was learning what it felt like to sit in a room where no one was coming, where the door was locked and she was the one who had locked it. On the second night, she slept. Not well, not deeply, but she lay down in a bed with sheets that smelled like soap and closed her eyes and stayed horizontal for 6 hours, which was more than she'd managed in months. She woke once, at 3 in the morning, certain she'd heard footsteps, but they were from the apartment above, someone getting a glass of water, living their own unremarkable life on the other side of a ceiling. And Marin lay back down and pressed her hand against the mattress and felt the solidity of it. The bed was real. The room was real. The lock was engaged. By the second week, she had started cooking. Eggs in the morning, pasta at night, a pot of soup on Sunday that lasted 3 days. She cooked slowly, tasting as she went, adjusting the seasoning without asking anyone's permission, adding garlic because she liked garlic, and Kieran had always said the smell was inconsiderate. She ate at the small table by the window. She ate the entire meal. She did not wrap anything in a napkin for later. She ate, the way people eat when food is nourishment and not a negotiation. Sable visited on a Wednesday evening. She brought tangerines and a paperback mystery she'd found at a used bookstore. Nothing literary. Just the kind of book you read in bed with a cup of tea, because that's a luxury. People who've never lost it don't recognize as one. They sat on the couch, and Sable peeled a tangerine, and Marin asked her about Yevna, about her mother, about the smile, about the car ride home from the birthday party. Did she ever leave? Marin asked. Sable looked at the tangerine peel in her hand. She arranged it on the coffee table in a small spiral, the way you do with your hands when your mouth is about to say something difficult. No, Sable said. She didn't. She stayed until I was 15. Then she had a stroke. She survived it, but she couldn't work anymore. And once she couldn't work, my father lost interest. He left. Just walked out one day. Didn't take anything. Didn't say goodbye. Just left. Like we were furniture he'd gotten bored of. Sable looked up. She's alive. She lives in a care facility upstate. I visit her on Sundays. She can't speak very well anymore, but she holds my hand and she watches the birds outside the window, and sometimes she smiles. A real smile. Not the other one. Marin reached out and took Sable's hand. She held it the way you hold something breakable. Not tightly, but completely. And neither of them spoke for a while. They just sat in the apartment on Hallworth Street with the radiator clicking and the evening light coming through the window, and the tangerine scent filling the room like a quiet, fragrant proof that sweetness still existed. On the first of the month, Marin called her mother. The phone rang 4 times. When Helene Castaldo answered, her voice had the cautious, brittle quality of a woman who had been waiting for a call she'd stopped believing would come. "Mom," Marin said. "It's me." The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds. Then Helene began to cry. Not the polite, suppressed crying of someone trying to maintain composure. The full, unguarded weeping of a mother who had lost her daughter to a man she couldn't reach, and a silence she couldn't cross. "I'm here," Marin said. "I'm safe. I'm sorry it took so long." "Don't you apologize," Helene said through her tears. "Don't you dare apologize. You're calling. That's all that matters. You're calling." They talked for 2 hours. Marin sat on the floor of the kitchen with her back against the cabinet and her knees drawn up, and told her mother everything. And Helene listened. And when it was over, Helene said, "I'm coming. I'm getting on a bus tomorrow." And for the first time in 6 years, Marin said the word that had been taken from her so gradually she hadn't noticed it was gone. "Yes," she said. "Please, come home." 3 months after the night at Leandro's, on a cold February evening with frost on the brownstone railings and breath visible in the streetlight, Maren Solera walked into a courtroom and sat beside Adair Lennox and faced the man she had married. Kieran Vosh sat across the aisle in a suit that fit him perfectly, his expression arranged into the mask of a reasonable man unfairly accused. His lawyer spoke in measured tones about misunderstandings, about a marriage under strain, about a wife who had perhaps been influenced by outside parties. Adair let him finish. Then she presented the evidence: the medical records, the financial documentation, the protective order. Dorrit's statement, Philippa's statement, Marin's 11-page affidavit, the bank's own correspondence confirming the transaction monitoring, the pattern, 6 years of it, laid out on paper with the precision of a blueprint. The judge reviewed the evidence for 40 minutes. Then she delivered her ruling: full dissolution of the marriage, asset division in Marin's favor, including the apartment, the vehicle, and 50% of joint holdings, a permanent restraining order, and a referral to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. Kieran's mask didn't slip. It shattered. Not loudly, not dramatically. It simply fell away, the way ice falls from a branch when the temperature changes. Silently, inevitably, revealing the bare wood underneath. He looked at Marin with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not cruelty. Fear. the raw, unprocessed fear of a man who had spent 6 years building a world he controlled and had just watched it collapse in a 40-minute ruling. Marin didn't look away. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she turned to Adair, and they walked out of the courtroom together. Outside, the February air was sharp and clean. Marin stood on the courthouse steps and breathed it in. She looked at the sky, which was the color of slate, and at the bare trees lining the street, and at her mother, Helene, who was standing at the bottom of the steps with her coat buttoned to the chin and her arms already open. Marin walked down the steps and into her mother's arms and stood there, on a public sidewalk, in the cold, and let herself be held. 2 blocks away, a dark car was parked along the curb. Inside it, Cesar Moretti sat with the engine running and the heater on. He hadn't gone inside the courthouse. He hadn't needed to. Declan had texted him the outcome 12 minutes after the ruling was read. One word: done. Cesar looked through the windshield at the courthouse steps. He could see 2 women embracing. He couldn't see their faces. He didn't need to. The posture told him everything. The way the older woman held the younger one, the way the younger one's shoulders finally released the tension they'd been carrying for months, the way they stood there as though the cold didn't matter, as though nothing mattered except that the distance between them had finally closed. Cesar put the car in drive. He pulled away from the curb, and the courthouse shrank in the rearview mirror until it was just another building in a city where, every day, someone's life changed permanently. He didn't look back, because looking back was for men who weren't certain they'd done the right thing, and Cesar Moretti had no uncertainty. Not about this. Somewhere on Hallworth Street, a deadbolt waited in its locked position. A radiator clicked its quiet rhythm. A row of boxwood hedges stood in the courtyard beneath a window where the kitchen light was on. And on the counter, beside a bowl of tangerines, a phone sat with a call log that showed a number labeled Mom, called 12 times in the last month, each call longer than the one before. Each one proof that when the silence between a mother and daughter is finally broken, what rushes in to fill the space is not noise, but something quieter and stronger and infinitely more durable. Love, the real kind. The kind that doesn't come with conditions.